Let me introduce myself first. I'm a policy officer at the European External Action Service, the diplomatic service of the European Union. I work within the directorate called Integrated Approach for Security and Peace, which ensures effective coordination of an European Union response throughout the different phases of the conflict, from early warning and horizon scanning to political strategic planning for crisis management and stabilization, as well as on the security of the EU citizens in crisis zones. In practical terms, the Directorate ensures that the EU response is conflict sensitive and based on a proper analysis with a focus on delivering stabilization and peace. In particular, I am part of the European Union Conflict Prevention and Mediation Team, which is responsible for ensuring a coordinated and integrated approach to conflict prevention, mediation, and peace building. This strange animal, this cell, is working to aim at 4 objectives in particular: helping identifying countries at risk of instability through the European Union Conflict Early Warning System. We conduct a conflict analysis of countries facing instability or violence. We advise on conflict sensitivity in fragile contexts. And last but not least, we provide support to mediation, dialogue, and prevention activities. Now, let me take through my intervention this morning, which fortunately for you will last not more than 10 minutes, I promised. I will structure my presentation in 3 parts. As a first thing, some words on the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on conflict dynamics, of course. Secondly, I will recall our commitment to take into account the climate change security challenge. Don't worry, I won't be long describing our policies, but instead I will give you some examples aiming at stepping up our efforts and further integrate climate dimension in our work. Finally, I won't tell you how good we are in climate-related work. I will tell you probably the contrary and how much we can improve. To conclude, I will share with you a long-term project. So if you are ready, let's start. So the global health crisis is reshaping conflict dynamics around the world in an unprecedented way. The pandemic serves as a conflict multiplier in fragile countries with pre-existing, of course, structural weaknesses underlying them, but may also destabilize seemingly stable countries. In some situations, on the other hand, it can provide unexpected opportunities for mediation and peace building. As a global actor, engaged in international action through many different streams and instruments, the European Union can act in several ways to reduce the destabilization related to the ongoing pandemic in its partner countries. And I can list at least 5 for you. Through conflict sensitivity, in line with the do no harm principle, new and reprogrammed funding and projects should consider specific criteria to ensure that support reaches the targeted populations in an inclusive, transparent, and effective manner. Through countering disinformation and hate speech and increase media literacy. Through an integrated conflict prevention. So coordination now is more necessary than ever, but has never been more difficult in this remote way of working. Through mediation and dialogue support, and let me expand a bit on this one. An external crisis can escalate a conflict, but also increase the options for resolution. In support of the United Nations Secretary General Guterres' call for the global ceasefire, the European Union can increase the appeal of a ceasefire or even persuade warring parties that the time has come to settle. Mediation support and the promotion of humanitarian dialogue could be timely in some countries and include enhancing information flows between parties or supporting process design and agenda setting. In some situations, the crisis can open possibilities to move forward with complex negotiations between conflict parties. For example, persuading one party to release political prisoners on medical grounds. The crisis offers opportunities to demonstrate good faith and improve relations or mitigate tensions through humanitarian gestures. The European Union is actively identifying opportunities for dialogue and cessation of hostilities, encourages reconciliation, humanitarian gestures, or sanction relief between rivals, and seizes the momentum to reinforce its mediation support to ensure that positive momentum is seized and can continue in a post-COVID era to be sustainable, of course. Finally, as last way to reduce destabilization, creative peace building. Even though the crisis may increase the appetite for dialogue, peace builders like you may not be able to engage directly with conflict parties in this situation. Rather than suspending conflict resolution efforts, the crisis calls for the engagement of local partners that still have the necessary access and capacity on the ground while respecting health regulations and the use of innovative technology to pursue community dialogue, monitoring human rights abuses, or activate long-range backups. Now, let's analyze the European commitment to the climate change and environmental emergency. In December 2019, the European Parliament approved a resolution declaring a climate and environmental emergency in Europe and globally. The global strategy for the European Union's foreign and security policy of 2016 recognized the link between the climate and security. This one was reiterated in the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions of February 2019 that underlined serious climate change implications for peace and security across the globe. The EU Green Deal, Angelo, you made the reference to it, which reinforces the Paris agreements, commits to make Europe carbon neutral by 2050, which would make us the world's first climate neutral continent. You will agree that is an ambitious target, is more a global perspective that shows that climate change is one of the biggest geopolitical challenges we face. It creates problems of distribution, and it's a driver of instability and migratory pressures. It's a threat multiplier. Climate change creates problems of social justice, raises tensions and risks of conflict, and poses a threat to human rights. This is why it's at the center of our foreign policies. The EU Green Deal is a milestone in our fight against climate change, and the opening of the Conference of Parties 25 in Madrid 2019 was the first official activity that Borrell, in his role of new High Representative of the European External Action Service, ran. The European Union wants to lead by example. The commitment to ensure that conflict prevention tools take into account climate security challenge is at the top of the European Union agenda, and in particular in the diplomatic service where I work. But to have a global impact, we need collective action, of course. Strengthening climate diplomacy means working in partnership. It's a problem that the EU cannot solve alone. That is why climate action is a key priority in our cooperation with partner countries, and not only. We work with multilateral partners like the UN, United Nations, and with local communities and with the civil society. The local, regional, and international dimensions are for us all very important. But how it works in practice? The EU delegations, our offices around the world, are stepping up their efforts with their host countries to advocate for the European Union's vision of the transition towards a sustainable future. We will do it using all the tools at our disposal, from trade diplomacy and technical assistance to capacity building and development cooperation, as well as our crisis management tools. Let's enter now in my area of competence. Strengthening the climate dimension in our conflict prevention and mediation tools is key for us in supporting the climate agenda. Since, as I previously said, climate change is currently undermining the good management of natural resources and it's threatening environmental stability, acting as a threat multiplier to international peace and security. At its core, it represents a security challenge with environmental, human rights, gender, political, economic, and social dimensions. Consequently, mediators like me will increasingly find themselves working to resolve conflicts where climate change has played a role in contributing to the outbreak of violence. The European Union should integrate climate change and environmental factors into its mediation efforts due to three primary reasons. The first one, growing relevance in conflict processes. According to recent data, between 40 and 60% of all civil wars over the past 60 years are driven by natural resources. Unless managed carefully, security risks posed by climate change will exacerbate conflict and to unprecedented levels. Whilst the mediation of such is increasingly frequent, the inclusion of natural resources issues is not yet a normalized practice. Unless this issue will be included, security risks posed by climate change will exacerbate the conflict to unprecedented levels, and peace agreements will increase an even higher failure of implementation than currently. Global actors also politicize these conflicts to an extent that third-party mediation will become increasingly important. As the EU is a value-driven actor with a clear mandate for global protection of the environment, it has a potential of playing a uniquely important role in this peace mediation field, uniting the immense know-how between all European Union services in environmental diplomacy, science and best practice, which is so far unparalleled. A dedicated center for such work as the UN would be of tremendous value added in this regard. Our unit is including environment into its conceptual and practical mediation work, including in training, updated EU concept on mediation, and the EU mediation guidelines. My division has hosted initial meetings on land degradation and mediation to produce guidance for the European Union official in mediation in partnership with the UNDEP. Then a second reason is the potential for dialogue and mediation support in this field. And the third one is the lack of global leadership. As the EU is a value-driven actor, as I said, with this clear mandate, it has a potential of playing this kind of role in the peace mediation field. The European Union must ensure that these factors are integrated in all its mediation interventions, and interventions has to be supported, leveraged, and funded by the European Union. Now, let's talk about the challenges, and then I will conclude. To accommodate the response to the ongoing crisis caused by the COVID-19, the European Commission could, for example, merge the Green Deal and digital agendas to create one joint agenda for resilience, which could offer an interesting link to conflict prevention and mediation work. EU recovery from the ongoing crisis will be in line with the sustainable and environmentally friendly principles stated in the Green Deal. Another challenge, the European External Action Service is in the lead of climate security and climate diplomacy. But other agencies, like for example the Director General for Clima, focusing on other aspects on the Green Deal, are in charge of the same issues as well. So the main challenges are coordination and cooperation between relevant actors, not only internally, but as well externally. With regard to mediation, natural resources are one of the most common drivers of conflict. This is not always fully integrated in mediation efforts. So my division has addressed this gap mainly through training and capacity building of head of delegations, the heads of these offices that we have around the world. The EU capacity to bring parties together is an added value, and there is a need to further empower actors, for example, through creating a center of excellence. This is something that we would like to do. With regard to conflict analysis and conflict prevention policy advice, our division notes a gap between the narratives of security-oriented and climate adaptation and development-oriented teams. There is a need to develop a shared understanding and vocabulary to tell the same story to the people with integrated perspective and to jointly respond to intertwined challenges. Then, of course, we need to strengthen the early warning system with concrete follow-up and clearly assigned tasks and deliverables that can address climate-related conflict threats. Finally, I would highlight some efforts to better integrate climate and environmental issues in our early warning system. For the ones that are not familiar with it, this system is an evidence-based risk management tool that identifies, assesses, and helps prioritize situations at risk of violent conflict for non-EU countries, focusing on structural factors and with a time horizons of 4 years, from 0 to 4 years. It also identifies conflict prevention and peace building opportunities. This effort to include climate and environmental issues in our early warning system is reflected into introduction of one climate indicator and two environmental indicators, water stress and oil production, within the global conflict risk index. I know it sounds a bit technical, but this is the way we use to identify risk of highly violent conflict to appear in countries. We also ensure that the climate dimension is integrated in our assessments, leading to a selection of conflict prevention priorities, including an assessment of vulnerability to climate change provided by Director General Klima. Finally, we also include a dedicated section on climate change and disasters as part of our assessment of structural risks of conflict. So, just to mention a few, we are having an enhanced focus on climate change as a conflict multiplier, land conflict and degradation in conflict analysis. In partnership, there is an enhanced focus on climate change and conflict prevention in ongoing partnership, for example, with the Joint Research Center of ISPRA, with the Civil Society Network for Conflict Prevention, and regional organization or the UN. As well as mediation, for example, we are having as well there an enhanced focus on these kind of issues in mediation training and guidelines, and then on capacity building, having dedicated training on climate, conflict, and land for the cadre of conflict prevention focal points. Now, to conclude, a best practice shared by the UN of its climate and security mechanism, which brings together the UN's political climate adaptation and develop pillars to consider climate change from a conflict prevention angle, provide field support and build capacity. I have a dream, an EU equivalent, or EU Green Peace mechanism, if you wish. This could similarly bring together relevant colleagues and experts from the political, conflict, development, climate, and disaster risk teams to work all together on this intertwined and complex issue. Climate adaptation works to create resilient societies, which in turn becomes less prone to conflict. This is the narrative that should be promoted, in my opinion.